Welcome to topic 6 on due diligence and selecting managers. In this topic, we have 5 readings that cover this material. The first one is on selection of a fund manager, so basic aspects associated with that. We're specifically obviously talking about private fund managers. So looking at the process involved, looking at their historical performance, other factors you take into consideration in that selection process. 6.2 looks at some cases of failed hedge funds and other types of investment strategies. Some specifically related to fraudulent activity by those involved in the fund, some related to technological issues or just bad strategies. And then the next 3 sections the next 3 readings focus on due diligence. The first is specifically related to the investment process, the second on operations, and the third one looks at all the different terms and business activities that investors would want to review as part of the due diligence process, things like lockup periods and notice periods, etc., that would be included in LPAs and investors would need to review or should review as part of the due diligence process. So we begin with reading 6.1 on the selection of a fund, of a private equity style fund manager. So here we look at, we start off by looking at essentially the relationship between the manager of a private equity fund, obviously referred to as the general partner, and the limited partners, and sort of the history and life cycle of that relationship. We look at the historical performance of private fund managers, specifically in the context of persistence. Do they, if they have top performing returns in one period, do they continue to exhibit top performing performance? Because obviously that's key when you're making investors are making an investment decision. And then how do we screen fund managers, these private fund managers, and what are sort of the general steps that we go through in that screening process?
All right, so we start out with, as I said, sort of looking at the relationship between the general partner and the limited partners of a private equity fund. So in terms of sort of some of the basics with respect to the relationship, so let's see here. It sort of goes through the sort of story of private equity funds with which we should be very familiar at this point. So we actually just in the previous reading talked about the key functions that the private equity fund engages in, and one of those is, of course, to find those portfolio companies that they expect to be successful and then invest in them. So that's one of the key things that's done, obviously, in the initial years in the investment period of the fund, as we just mentioned earlier. So that's sort of, essentially kind of the first fund that private equity, the fund manager may have established. They find these portfolio companies, private companies, they invest in them. And then generally GPs want to, continue making investments. So after the capital is invested for that particular fund, then they start to raise capital for new funds. And so they tend to do this every about 3 to 5 years. So once they've identified these private companies, then they move on to starting a new fund. And as we talked about in a previous section as well, in a previous reading, this is limited to some degree, or what the limited partners want to limit this to make sure that GPs, or at least when it's necessary, in particular during that investment period, are focused on the initial fund and they're not moving too quickly onto new funds. Okay, and then generally GPs that have good relationships with their LPs tend to continue on to the next fund, and that's beneficial to both parties. The GPs don't have to go fundraising to new investors.